Three black SUVs turned onto Westheimer Road and rolled to a stop in a perfect line outside the restaurant, smooth and deliberate, like a move rehearsed long before the engines ever touched that stretch of Houston pavement. The motors stayed running. Heat shimmered above the hoods. The windows were tinted so dark that no one standing on the sidewalk could see who sat inside. For a few suspended seconds, nothing happened. Then the front door of the lead SUV opened. A man stepped out. He looked to be around 30. Tall. Broad-shouldered. Tailored charcoal suit. Crisp white shirt. Polished shoes that caught the Houston sun and flashed once as he planted his feet on the curb. He buttoned his jacket with one hand, not out of nerves but out of habit. Men like him learned early that calm was a kind of power, and he wore that power as naturally as the suit on his back. He lifted his eyes to the restaurant sign above the entrance and studied it for a moment. He did not rush. Men like him never do. Inside, at a corner table near the kitchen, a 74-year-old woman sat alone. Her plate was gone. Her food was in the trash behind the bar. Her hands were folded quietly in her lap. She had already given this place enough of her tears long before anyone noticed she had not shed a single one. The man started walking toward the door. 2 hours earlier, that same corner table had been empty. The lunch crowd had only begun to build. Glasses clinked softly. Silverware tapped against plates. Quiet music floated beneath the low murmur of business conversations and polite laughter. The restaurant was the kind of place that liked to think of itself as refined. Cloth napkins. Muted lighting. Carefully plated food. The sort of room where people did not simply eat lunch, they performed it. Then the front door opened, and a small elderly woman stepped inside carrying nothing but a worn leather handbag and a quiet hunger. Her name was Kesse. She was 74 years old, 5'2", with a thin frame and skin the color of polished mahogany. Her white hair was cropped close to her head. Her deep brown eyes held the kind of steadiness that comes only from surviving enough years to stop asking the world for permission. She wore a simple faded green cotton dress, flat brown sandals, and a thin gold wedding band on her left hand. She moved slowly but not with weakness. She moved with certainty. With the stillness of someone who already knew exactly who she was. The Houston heat had worn her down. She had been walking through the Galleria area looking for a gift for her great-granddaughter when the smell of something warm and rich drifted through an open doorway and pulled her inside. Amma stopped at the hostess stand and waited with patient dignity, the way people wait when they were raised to believe that courtesy should be met with courtesy. Behind the stand stood Vanessa Cole, 34 years old, restaurant manager, blonde highlights falling in perfect waves, makeup untouched, posture exact, smile ready for the right kind of customer. That smile vanished the moment she looked up and saw the woman standing there. "Can I help you?" she asked. Amma offered a small, tired smile of her own. "Yes. I would like a table, please. Just for one." Vanessa's eyes moved quickly from Amma's face to the faded dress, to the flat sandals, to the old handbag and then back again. In that brief sweep, she decided far more than seating. She decided value. She decided status. She decided, without asking a single real question, what kind of story this woman must belong to. "Do you have a reservation?" "No," Amma said softly. "I was just passing by." The food smelled wonderful. The answer gave Vanessa exactly what she wanted, an excuse. "We're fully booked for lunch," she said. Amma turned her head slightly and looked across the dining room. Half the tables were empty. The lie sat between them so plainly that neither woman had to name it. "It looks like there are open tables," Amma said. "They're reserved," Vanessa replied. Then, with a smile so thin it was almost sharp, she added, "You might try the food court down the street." Food court. The words landed softly, but they landed hard. Not because Amma had never heard such things before, but because she had. In different cities. In different tones. In different decades. The language changed. The meaning never did. For a moment she said nothing. She did not argue. She did not ask Vanessa to explain. She simply held the younger woman's gaze long enough to let the ugliness of the suggestion exist in the open air between them. Then Amma nodded once. "I will wait," she said, "in case something opens." There was a small bench near the entrance, more decorative than useful. Amma walked to it, sat down, placed her worn handbag beside her feet, and folded her hands neatly in her lap. She did not hunch. She did not shrink. She sat with the composure of a queen waiting through a delay she had no intention of allowing to define her. Some battles are not fought with fists. Some are fought by refusing to move. Near the front windows, sunlight slid across the polished floor. People came in and out. Men in pressed shirts. Women with expensive purses. Young professionals laughing as if every room in the city had always been built for them. Amma watched them all with a quiet face. She did not beg for a table. She did not perform hunger. She simply waited, and in that waiting there was a kind of power no one behind the hostess stand seemed able to recognize. 15 minutes passed. A table opened and Amma straightened slightly, thinking perhaps simple time had done what fairness would not. Instead, Vanessa welcomed a man who had walked in after her. No reservation. Sport coat. Expensive watch. Easy confidence. He did not even glance toward the old woman on the bench as he was led to a table that had apparently been reserved only moments earlier. Amma said nothing. 10 more minutes passed. Another table opened. This time a young couple in athletic clothes were shown to their seats. No reservation. They looked comfortable in the room, and that was enough for Vanessa. Youth, money, or the appearance of both could turn a full restaurant into a flexible one. Amma watched all of it. She watched menus appear for others. Water glasses fill. Bread baskets arrive. She watched people settle into the ordinary privilege of being welcomed without having to earn it. And still she said nothing. That silence was not surrender. It was discipline. Because Amma Kesse had lived long enough to understand that some people reveal themselves most clearly when no one interrupts them. Around her, the restaurant continued as though nothing cruel was happening in plain sight. Servers moved between tables. The music kept playing. Guests glanced toward the entrance and then away. Injustice often survives not because it is hidden, but because everyone in the room decides they would rather remain comfortable than honest. 45 minutes after Amma first walked in, a waitress named Elena Cruz noticed that the elderly woman was still sitting on the bench by the door. Elena was 26, hardworking, dark hair tied back, kind eyes sharpened by long shifts and the habit of seeing what others missed. She had been moving fast all afternoon, carrying plates, refilling water, balancing orders in her head. But there are some things speed cannot erase from a decent person's mind, and the sight of that small woman still waiting had begun to trouble her. She approached with a gentle voice. "Ma'am, are you waiting for a table?" Amma looked up at her. "Yes." The manager said they were booked. "But I have watched people be seated." Elena's eyes flicked toward Vanessa at the front stand and then back to Amma. In that instant she understood enough. Maybe not every detail. But enough. "Please wait 1 second," Elena said. She crossed the room to the back section where 2 empty tables had sat untouched the entire time. She pulled out a chair, straightened the setting, and then came back with a smile that held no performance in it at all. "Follow me, ma'am. I have a table for you." It was the worst table in the restaurant, tucked into the back corner near the kitchen door, half hidden from the main dining room. Plates would rattle nearby. Staff would brush past. It was the place people got seated when the restaurant wanted them invisible. But it was a table. And Amma rose with grace and followed her as though Elena had just escorted her into a palace. When Amma sat down, she did not sit like someone who had finally been given leftovers. She sat like someone who understood that dignity does not depend on where others place you. She adjusted the hem of her faded green dress, set her handbag on the empty chair beside her, and folded her hands lightly on the table. "Thank you, dear," she said. "You're welcome," Elena replied. "My name is Elena. I'll be taking care of you." There was warmth in the exchange, small but unmistakable. The kind of warmth that comes when one person chooses to restore what another person has had withheld. Amma looked around the back corner. The kitchen door swung open and shut with bursts of steam and sound. She could smell roasted meat, butter, herbs, and hot bread. Voices from the dining room reached her in softened waves. It was not the best seat in the house. But hunger has a way of making room for gratitude, and courtesy has a way of making even a poor seat feel human. For a moment, Amma simply rested there and let the tension leave her shoulders. Across the restaurant, Elena could already feel Vanessa moving toward them. Some conflicts arrive loudly. Others approach in high heels, wearing a manager's smile and carrying authority like a threat. By the time Vanessa reached the table, the smile was gone. "Elena." "A word." Vanessa's voice was low, but there was enough steel in it to stop any server mid-step. Elena set down the menu in front of Amma and followed the manager a few feet away. The distance was short. The meaning was not. "I told her we were booked," Vanessa whispered. Elena kept her own voice controlled. "Half the restaurant is empty." "That's not the point." Vanessa's eyes did not leave Amma as she spoke. "She doesn't fit the clientele." Elena stared at her, trying for 1 second to believe she had heard wrong. "She's an old woman who's hungry. She's not our customer." The words came out cold and practiced, as if Vanessa had repeated some version of them in her head so many times they no longer sounded cruel to her at all. Elena felt anger rise in her chest, hot and immediate. Then what was I supposed to do? Let her sit there until closing? Vanessa's jaw tightened. "Watch your tone. You are replaceable." And there it was. Not just the insult to Amma, but the warning to anyone who might challenge the insult. Vanessa turned and walked away before Elena could answer. For a brief moment Elena stood still, carrying a menu in one hand and the weight of what she had just heard in the other. Then she took a breath, lifted her chin and returned to the table. If she was replaceable, she thought, then let kindness be the thing they had to replace. Elena placed the menu in front of Amma and waited while the older woman read it slowly and carefully. Amma did not pretend familiarity. She took her time, tracing the lines with her eyes, weighing the choices, respecting the meal before it had even arrived. Finally she looked up and pointed to one item. "I'll have the braised lamb, the roasted vegetables and a glass of water." Elena paused for only a second. It was not the cheapest item on the menu. It was not a timid order. Amma had not come inside to take up as little space as possible. She had come to eat. "Yes, ma'am," Elena said. "Right away." As Elena walked the order to the kitchen, Amma leaned back slightly and let the atmosphere of the place settle around her. She could still feel the sting of the bench, of the lie, of being passed over while others were welcomed. But she had reached the simple thing she came for: a seat, a plate, a meal. Sometimes that is all a person wants from the world. Not admiration. Not apology. Just the ordinary peace of being allowed to exist without being treated as a problem. At the hostess stand, Vanessa glanced toward the back corner again and again. Irritation had settled over her now, sharper because Amma had not caused a scene. Cruel people often prefer anger they can answer. Quiet dignity leaves them standing face to face with themselves. A few minutes later, the plate arrived, hot and fragrant, carrying with it the promise of comfort. When Elena set the food down, steam rose from the braised lamb in slow ribbons. The roasted vegetables glistened with oil and herbs. The smell was rich and deep, the kind of smell that speaks to the body before the mind has time to form words. Amma looked at the plate for a moment as though receiving something sacred. Then she closed her eyes and breathed in. When she lifted her fork and took the first bite, something in her face softened. Not dramatically. Not for show. Just enough for Elena, standing nearby, to notice that this meal had touched something larger than hunger. Amma smiled. It was a real smile, the kind that begins somewhere in the chest before it reaches the mouth. For one brief instant the noise of the restaurant seemed to recede, and another kitchen, older, warmer, farther away, seemed to live behind her eyes. A remembered room. A remembered hand. A meal once shared with people who loved her before the world learned how to measure worth in surfaces and appearances. She ate slowly. She savored every bite. She cut each piece with care, not because she was fragile, but because she knew the value of taking in goodness without rushing it. This was what should have happened from the beginning. A hungry woman had found food. A table had held her. A meal had done what meals have always done at their best, remind a person that they belong in the world. Then Vanessa returned. This time Vanessa was not alone. Standing a step behind her was Noah Reed, 19 years old, a busboy with a dish towel in his hands and the look of someone who already knew he had been brought into a moment he wanted no part of. He avoided Amma's eyes. Avoided Elena's too. There are many ways people become witnesses to wrongdoing. Sometimes all it takes is being too young to know how to refuse an order. "Ma'am," Vanessa said, stopping at the table, "I'm going to need this table back." Amma looked up, fork still in hand. "I'm sorry?" "We have a party coming in. You'll have to leave." Amma glanced at her plate, then at the empty tables nearby, then back at Vanessa. "But I am still eating. I can have your food boxed." The offer had the flat tone of a command disguised as service. Amma's eyes moved once more toward the back section. 2 tables still sat empty. No coats draped over their chairs. No glasses poured. No guests approaching. The lie was becoming less careful now. "There are empty tables right there," Amma said. "They are reserved." Again. Something tightened in Noah's face. Elena, watching from near the kitchen door, went very still. Amma placed her fork down with deliberate calm. "I would like to finish my food." Vanessa leaned slightly closer. The fake smile disappeared completely. What remained was not impatience. It was contempt with the mask removed. "Let me be honest," Vanessa said in a voice low enough to sound private and loud enough to humiliate. "This restaurant has a certain standard. Our regular customers expect a certain atmosphere when they come here. You are not part of that atmosphere. You were not supposed to be seated here in the first place. Now I am asking you nicely. Please leave." The words hung there for a beat, ugly and undeniable. Amma looked at Vanessa without blinking. She had heard this speech before. Not these exact sentences, but the shape of them. The poison inside them. The old message wrapped in fresh language and sent out again into another room, another decade, another polished place pretending cruelty was professionalism. "You do not belong here." Her voice, when it came, did not rise. "I would like to finish my food." That was all. No pleading. No anger. No attempt to prove herself worthy. Just the simple restatement of a right so basic it should have embarrassed anyone forcing her to defend it. Around them the restaurant changed. People sensed the tension, even those pretending not to look. Cutlery slowed. Conversations frayed. The room developed that strange, brittle awareness that comes when everyone realizes a line is about to be crossed and wonders whether they will have the courage to acknowledge it once it has. Vanessa straightened. Her eyes dropped to the plate. And then she made a choice from which nothing in the room could turn back. Vanessa reached down, picked up the plate, and pulled it away just as Amma's hand moved toward it. "Please," Amma said. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was a word spoken with the force of simple humanity. Vanessa turned anyway. She walked to the bar as if the act were routine, as if she were clearing away the remains of an ordinary meal from an ordinary table. Then she tipped the plate over the trash. The lamb slid down first. The roasted vegetables followed. The plate struck the metal rim with a hard, ugly sound that cut through the room like something breaking. And the restaurant went quiet. Not silent. Quiet. The kind of quiet filled with lowered eyes and tightened mouths, where everyone understands they have just witnessed cruelty but most are already searching for ways to keep from naming it aloud. Elena stood frozen by the kitchen door, one hand flying to her mouth. Noah remained still, the dish towel hanging uselessly from his fingers, his whole body radiating the shame of being present and powerless. Guests stared at water glasses, menus, windows, each other, anywhere but directly at the truth. And Amma sat in the back corner with nothing left in front of her except a glass of water. No plate. No food. No outrage performed for the comfort of those who had failed her. Just a 74-year-old woman, sitting upright in a faded green dress, carrying the unbearable weight of being publicly told what some people believed about her place in the world. If Amma had shouted, the room might have known what to do. People understand noise. They understand conflict that announces itself. It lets them choose a side or at least pretend the problem is equally shared. But Amma did not shout. She did not stand. She did not cry. She did not fling the water glass or call Vanessa names or demand witnesses. She sat with her hands resting lightly on the table and let the insult stand in its own ugliness. That was somehow harder for everyone to bear. Because now the restaurant could not hide behind the idea of a disturbance. The disturbance had not come from the old woman in the faded dress. It had come from the institution around her. From the manager in heels. From the silent room. From every person who had decided a line of cruelty was not their problem so long as it did not touch their table. Amma lowered her eyes only once, and even then it was not in surrender. It was the look of someone steadying herself against an old pain that had returned wearing a new face. She had lived too long to be surprised by prejudice. But being prepared for a wound does not mean it cannot hurt. Near the kitchen, Elena took a step forward and then stopped, not because she did not want to help, but because years of working under power had taught her how dangerous the wrong interruption could be. Then Amma reached into her handbag. From the worn leather bag, Amma took out a small silver flip phone. The sight of it looked almost fragile in her hands, a simple old device in a room full of polished modern surfaces. She opened it carefully. Pressed one button. Raised it to her ear. It rang twice. Nana? The voice that answered was deep, alert, immediate. Malik, Amma said softly, I'm at a restaurant on Westheimer. I think you should come. On the other end, something sharpened. Are you all right? Amma's answer held all the steadiness she had been guarding since the moment she walked through the door. I'm fine, child. Take your time. I'm not going anywhere. She closed the phone, folded it shut, and returned it to her bag. No one in the room knew exactly who Malik was. But the tenderness in the word Nana, and the focus that came into Amma's face after the call, changed something in the air. Not because power had arrived yet, but because certainty had. The story was not finished. The room could feel it. A minute later Vanessa returned with the bill and placed it on the table as if settling an inconvenience. $68. For food Amma had not been allowed to finish. For food Vanessa herself had thrown away. The insult could have ended there. Instead, Amma reached calmly into her handbag again, took out cash, counted 4 $20 bills, and placed them on top of the check. $80. Including tip. No one who saw it would forget that part. When Vanessa returned and saw the cash on the bill, irritation flashed across her face. You've paid, she said. I need the table. Amma folded her hands again. I told my grandson I would be here. You can wait outside. I'll wait here. The answer came without force, but it landed like a closed door. Vanessa wanted a scene. She wanted raised voices, resistance, something she could recast as disruption and use to justify herself. But Amma had paid. Amma was calm. Amma had given her nothing except the mirror of her own behavior. So the older woman remained at the table, still as carved stone. Time moved strangely after that. The room returned halfway to its earlier rhythm, but not fully. Conversations tried to resume and failed. Guests chewed and listened. Servers passed by more quietly than before. The kitchen worked in muffled bursts. Everyone felt themselves suspended in the aftershock of something they suspected would soon have consequences. Amma sat with the grace of someone who had spent a lifetime learning that dignity is not only how you enter a room. It is how you remain in one after others have tried to push you out. Outside, traffic moved along Westheimer. Sunlight shifted. Inside, Vanessa paced behind the hostess stand and checked the door more often than necessary. 14 minutes later, the SUVs arrived. And suddenly every person in the restaurant looked up at once. The 3 black SUVs stopped with the quiet confidence of expensive machines handled by disciplined people. Heads turned all across the dining room. Even those who had not cared to notice Amma now noticed this. The front door of the lead SUV opened. A tall man stepped out. He was 6'3", clean-shaven, composed, dressed in a dark charcoal suit cut so precisely it seemed to sharpen the air around him. His shoes were polished. His face was calm. He carried no visible anger, and that made him more intimidating, not less. Rage is loud and easy to dismiss. Controlled power has a different effect. It changes a room before it even enters it. 4 more people stepped out behind him, 2 men and 2 women in business attire, each carrying tablets or portfolios. Not security. Not family. Team. Inside, Vanessa straightened instinctively and arranged her expression into the polished smile she used when she believed status had finally arrived in a form she recognized. Good afternoon. Welcome. Do you have a reservation? The man did not look at her. His eyes moved across the room in one clean sweep and settled on the back corner table. On his grandmother. On the empty space where her plate should have been. On the cash lying over the bill. On the untouched glass of water. Then he walked past Vanessa without breaking stride. Every eye in the restaurant followed him as he crossed the dining room. He did not hesitate. He did not scan tables. He did not need directions. He walked straight to the back corner and stopped in front of Amma Kesse. Nana, he said. Amma looked up at him, and for the first time that afternoon warmth touched her face in an unmistakable way. Hello, my boy. The words were gentle. Familiar. Full of history. He glanced at the table. Where is your food? Amma did not point. She did not narrate what had been done to her. She only turned her eyes briefly toward the trash behind the bar. That was enough. The man, Malik, followed her glance. His expression did not explode. It tightened by a fraction, and somehow that was worse. He turned toward Vanessa. You threw her food away. It was not a question. Not in wording. Not in tone. Just a fact placed into the center of the room. Vanessa opened her mouth quickly. Sir, there was a misunderstanding. I'm not asking what happened, Malik said, quiet as a blade laid flat on a table. I can see what happened. Then, to the surprise of everyone watching, he sat down across from his grandmother. He did not loom over the moment. He joined her in it. Behind him, his team remained standing, still and attentive, as though they had walked into many rooms before and knew exactly when to let silence do the first part of the work. Malik rested one hand on the table and looked at Vanessa as though measuring not only her answer, but the entire system that had allowed her to ask an old woman to leave a table she had paid for. Do you know who this woman is? He asked. Vanessa swallowed. Her confidence had already begun to leak from her face. No. He nodded once. This is Amma Kesse, founder and chairwoman of Kesse International. She built a company that employs thousands of people across 3 continents. The words spread through the room like a dropped glass. No one moved. Malik continued, each sentence placed with deliberate precision. She owns commercial properties all over Texas. Vanessa's fingers tightened around the back of a chair. And one of those properties, Malik said, is this building. The room seemed to lose sound altogether. At the bar, a man who had looked away earlier now stared openly. A woman near the window lifted a hand to her mouth. Noah, the busboy, looked as though the floor had vanished beneath him. Elena stood motionless, both horrified and vindicated at once. Malik did not raise his voice. He did not need to. This restaurant pays rent to a management company owned by my grandmother's corporation. Which means every month your boss writes a check to the woman whose food you just threw in the trash. Vanessa's face went pale. I didn't know, she said. And then, before Malik could answer, Amma spoke. You did not need to know. Amma's voice was steady, clear, and somehow more devastating than anger could have been. She looked directly at Vanessa, not as a landlord to an employee, not as a powerful woman to a frightened one, but as one human being confronting another with the truth. You did not need to know who I was to treat me with decency. The restaurant listened. I was an old woman who walked in hungry and asked for a table. That was all you needed to know. Vanessa's eyes filled almost instantly, but Amma did not soften yet. Mercy, when it comes too soon, can become an escape. You looked at my dress, my sandals, my age, my accent, and decided I was less than the people already sitting here. I'm sorry, Vanessa whispered. You are sorry now, Amma said, because my grandson arrived in a suit. There was no cruelty in Amma's tone. That was what made it unbearable. She was not humiliating Vanessa for pleasure. She was naming what everyone in the room had seen and failed to stop. Malik watched his grandmother with quiet respect. This, more than business titles or ownership documents, was the real authority in the room. Not wealth. Not leverage. Moral clarity. Vanessa looked as though the apology had collapsed inside her mouth before it fully left it. For the first time that day she was being forced to face what her behavior had actually been, stripped of excuses, stripped of hierarchy, stripped even of the convenience of ignorance. Then Malik took out his phone. When Malik placed the call, the room listened the way people listen when consequence finally acquires a voice. Richard Hale, he said the moment the line connected. I'm in your restaurant. Your manager just threw my grandmother's food in the trash because she didn't look wealthy enough to eat here. I need you here in 15 minutes. He hung up without waiting for a reply. Then he turned slightly toward one of the women standing behind him. Pull the lease file. I want the termination clause on my desk today. Her fingers moved immediately over the tablet in her hand. At that, Vanessa's composure finally cracked. She sank into the nearest chair as if her knees had given way beneath her. Power looks abstract until it is attached to paperwork. Until it can rewrite futures before dessert service ends. Please, she said, looking first at Malik, then at Amma. I have bills. I can't lose this job. Malik's jaw tightened, but he did not answer. He looked to his grandmother. Amma studied Vanessa for a long, silent moment. Not with triumph. Not with coldness. With a deeper and more difficult expression, assessment. Around them, the restaurant remained frozen between spectacle and shame. Every guest understood they were no longer merely watching an awkward incident unfold. They were watching a decision about justice. About power. About what should happen when cruelty is finally exposed and the injured person has enough influence to answer it any way she pleases. Then Amma spoke. Stand up. Vanessa rose shakily. How old are you? Amma asked. 34. Amma nodded once, almost to herself. When I was 34, I slept on the floor of a warehouse with $11 to my name and a shipment I prayed would make it to New Orleans. The room drew in closer around her words. People told me I was too old, too small, too African, too female to build a business in America. She held Vanessa's gaze. I built it anyway. There was no boasting in the statement. Only memory. Only the hard, clean weight of lived truth. Amma had entered the restaurant looking like a woman someone imagined could be dismissed. But now as she spoke, the years behind her seemed to fill the room, The risks, the shipments, the nights without certainty, the humiliations survived without surrender. Not a fantasy of success. The price of it. Even the kitchen had grown quiet. Metal no longer clattered. No orders were called. The whole place seemed gathered around this one small woman in the faded green dress, as though discovering, too late, that stillness can contain entire empires. I did not build my business by deciding who deserved a seat at the table, Amma said. She let the sentence rest for a beat. I built it by giving people one. Something visibly broke in Vanessa then. Not only fear. Something closer to recognition. The dawning horror of seeing the person she had chosen to be from the outside for the first time. A few minutes later, the front door burst open and Richard Hale hurried inside, red-faced and breathless, tie loosened, apology already halfway out of his mouth. I am so sorry, he began. I had no idea. You had no idea, Malik said, rising now, because you built a culture where this could happen. Richard stopped short. His eyes darted from Malik to Amma, from Amma to the empty table, to Vanessa sitting pale and shaken nearby, and then around the room at all the witnesses who no longer looked willing to pretend. He understood enough. This is unacceptable, he said quickly, turning toward Vanessa with the instinctive speed of a man trying to cut away the visible problem before anyone looks deeper. She's fired. No, Amma said. One word. Come. Final. Everyone turned. Malik frowned slightly. Nana? Amma lifted a hand and he fell silent. If you fire her today, Amma said, she learns nothing. She goes home angry. She blames me. And she becomes crueler to the next person in a faded dress. The truth of it settled heavily over the room. Richard blinked, caught off guard by mercy where he had expected rightful punishment. Vanessa looked up slowly, her face wet now, stunned not only by what might be spared, but by who was choosing to spare it. Amma turned her full attention back to the manager. You will keep your job, she said. But not your excuses. For the next 30 days, Amma continued, you will greet every person who walks through that door as if they might own this building. The sentence moved through the room like a bell. Vanessa let out a small, broken sound and pressed trembling fingers to her mouth. Fear had brought tears to her eyes before. This was different. This was the shock of receiving mercy from the very person she had tried to humiliate, and feeling all at once how undeserved and how instructive that mercy was. Amma then looked to Richard. And you will train your staff. You will change your culture. You will fix what you built. Richard nodded immediately, too fast, desperate to agree, but the desperation did not erase the truth. This had not happened in isolation. Vanessa had acted inside an environment that had taught her, subtly or openly, who mattered and who did not. Restaurants, companies, institutions, none become cruel by accident. They are trained into it. Rewarded into it. Allowed into it. Malik remained standing beside the table, silent but watchful, letting his grandmother's words define the outcome. There was a kind of relief in the room now, but it was not comfort. It was the relief that comes when justice chooses not to become vengeance. Harder perhaps than firing. Harder because it demanded change. Amma, still seated, still composed, had turned the entire room into a classroom no one had volunteered to enter. And then a soft voice came from near the kitchen. Ma'am? Elena had been standing near the kitchen doorway, waiting for a moment that felt respectful enough to speak. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her apron, but when Amma looked up, the young waitress found her courage. May I bring you another plate of the lamb? She asked softly. On the house. For the first time since Malik arrived, true warmth returned to Amma's face in a way everyone could see. What is your name, dear? Elena Cruz. Amma's eyes brightened. You are the one who seated me when no one else would. Yes, ma'am. You risked your job for a stranger. Elena swallowed. It was just the right thing to do. The simplicity of the answer landed with extraordinary force. Not because it was dramatic but because it was plain. So plain that it revealed how complicated everyone else had made what should never have been difficult. Amma reached out and took Elena's hand. "You remind me of myself when I was your age." Elena's eyes widened, and for a second she looked like she might cry from the sheer unexpectedness of being seen. Amma turned toward Malik. "Write down her name." He did so without hesitation. "When you are ready to do more than serve tables," Amma said to Elena, "call my grandson. We have a management training program. We look for people who do the right thing when it costs something." Elena drew in a breath as if the room itself had shifted beneath her. "Thank you," she whispered. Amma smiled. "Bring me that lamb." Elena laughed through the tears gathering in her eyes and hurried toward the kitchen, carrying with her not only an order, but a kind of restoration. And then something unexpected happened. A man from the bar stood up. He had been there through the whole scene, watching first with curiosity, then discomfort, then shame. Now he walked slowly toward Amma's table, stopped at a respectful distance and cleared his throat. "Ma'am," he said, "I saw what happened earlier. I should have said something. I didn't. I'm sorry." Amma looked at him with the same steady gaze she had turned on everyone else that day. Then she nodded once. "You are saying it now," she said. "That counts." The man lowered his head, grateful and humbled at once. Then a woman from a window table stood and came over. Then another guest. Then another. One by one, people who had stared into their glasses and said nothing began walking toward the back corner, drawn by conscience now that someone had shown them how thin their excuses had been. Each apology was awkward in its own way. Some direct. Some halting. Some almost ashamed to take up space in front of the woman they had failed. But they came. Vanessa watched every one of them as though each person were holding up a mirror. Cruelty isolates its target first. Accountability reverses the direction. It turns the gaze back toward the room that allowed the cruelty to happen. By then Vanessa was no longer crying only for herself. The sight before her had become impossible to ignore. The old woman in the faded green dress, whom Vanessa had treated like a burden, like a stain on the atmosphere, like someone to be pushed toward a food court, had become the moral center of the room. Not because of the wealth just revealed. Not because of the black SUVs outside. But because grace under humiliation had exposed everyone else more clearly than anger ever could. Vanessa could see Elena, the young waitress she had threatened, now being honored. She could see the guest who had remained silent finding the courage to speak. She could see Richard forced to confront the culture of his own business. She could see Malik powerful enough to shut the place down, choosing restraint because his grandmother had chosen something harder than revenge. And she could finally see herself. Not the polished manager. Not the keeper of standards. Not the woman in control of the door. Just a human being who had looked at another human being and decided, based on appearance, that cruelty could be justified. The lesson was cutting because it was clean. There was nowhere left to hide. No misunderstanding to hide behind. No confusion. No gray area. Just a terrible choice plainly made. Sometimes the beginning of change is not being forgiven. Sometimes it is being understood accurately. And in that moment, Vanessa understood exactly what she had done. A few minutes later Elena emerged from the kitchen carrying a fresh plate of braised lamb. Steam curled upward. The vegetables were bright and carefully arranged. The scent of herbs and slow-cooked meat moved through the air again, but now it carried something more than appetite. It carried repair. Elena approached the table carefully, almost ceremonially, and placed the plate in front of Amma with both hands. "There you are, ma'am." Amma looked down at the meal. For a beat the room seemed to hold its breath with her. Then she closed her eyes, breathed in the aroma, lifted her fork and took a bite. And she smiled. This time the smile was fuller. Not because the food had changed though it was hot and perfect, but because the meaning around it had. She was no longer merely eating lunch. She was receiving back, in public, the simple human decency that should never have been denied her in the first place. Malik sat across from her again. The black SUVs remained outside. His team stood nearby, no longer tense so much as settled, as if the essential verdict had already been delivered. Around them, people watched in silence, but the silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of avoidance. It was the silence that follows truth when no one wants to interrupt it. In the back corner near the kitchen, the worst table in the restaurant had become the most important one. No one who sat in that restaurant that afternoon would forget what they had just seen. They had watched an old woman be judged by her dress, her sandals, her age, her accent, her handbag, the slowness of her walk, the quietness of her request. They had watched a manager lie to her, pass others ahead of her, seat her only when compassion disobeyed prejudice, and then take a plate from her hands and throw it in the trash. They had also watched something else. They had watched dignity remain seated when humiliation wanted it to rise. They had watched power arrive not in noise, but in a man who crossed a room and called her Nana. They had watched wealth, ownership, and leverage reverse the balance of fear, but they had also been forced to hear what mattered more than any of that none of those things should have been necessary for decency. Amma had said it plainly. You did not need to know who I was. The truth of that sentence now belonged to everyone in the room. To Richard. To Vanessa. To the guest who apologized. To Noah, whose silence would likely haunt him into adulthood. To Elena, whose courage had been confirmed rather than punished. To Malik, who knew his grandmother had once again taught a room more than business ever could. Even the walls seemed to hold the lesson. The value of a person is not revealed by whether the world recognizes their importance. It is revealed by whether we treat them as human before we know anything else. Amma ate slowly, peacefully, as if reclaiming the meal was also a way of reclaiming the afternoon itself. Across from her, Malik said little. He did not need to. His presence, his call, his authority had mattered. But even he understood that this was his grandmother's moment, not because she had been wronged, but because she had chosen what to do with the power to answer that wrong. Richard remained nearby, chastened and quiet, already imagining the conversations he would have to have, the training he would have to implement, the assumptions he would have to rip out by the roots if he wanted to deserve the second chance he had just seen extended through his business. Vanessa stood a little farther back, no longer hiding behind the hostess stand. Her posture had changed. Not perfected. Not redeemed in an instant. But altered. Humbled. As if she understood that the next 30 days would not be punishment alone. They would be an invitation to become someone different from the woman who had looked at a hungry elder and seen inconvenience. The guests returned slowly to their seats, carrying the discomfort and gratitude of people who had witnessed something larger than a confrontation. They had witnessed a moral reckoning. Amma lifted another bite of lamb and chewed thoughtfully. Then she looked up, not at any one person in particular, but almost at the room itself, and the room seemed to understand that the lesson was not over just because the crisis had ended. Some truths arrive only after the danger passes. The black SUVs outside had changed the room. Of course they had. Wealth always does. Status always does. Titles, property, influence, these things still move through the world like keys, opening doors that remain closed to others. But the deeper lesson of that afternoon was not that an old woman should be respected because she turned out to be powerful. It was that she should have been respected before anyone knew she was. Whether her grandson had arrived in a charcoal suit or on a city bus, Amma Kesse deserved to eat her food in peace. Whether she owned the building or rented a room across town, she deserved a table. Whether she had a corporation behind her or only the cash in her handbag, she deserved honesty. Whether a team followed behind her grandson or no one came at all, she deserved not to have her lunch dumped in a trash can while a room full of people looked away. That was the part of the story that mattered most because it did not depend on a reveal. It depended on character. Who are you when the person in front of you appears to have nothing you need? Who are you when decency offers no advantage? Those are the questions restaurants ask. Companies ask. Cities ask. Families ask. Nations ask. And in the back corner of one Houston dining room, a faded green dress asked them more powerfully than any boardroom ever could. At its core, the whole afternoon had begun with something almost embarrassingly simple. Amma had been hungry. That was all. She had been walking in the Houston heat, looking for a gift for her great-granddaughter. The day had worn her down. The smell of warm food had drifted toward her. She had stepped inside, tired and hopeful, and asked for a table for one. There are stories so large they are built out of ordinary needs denied. Not grand ambitions. Not dramatic conflicts. Just food, shelter, welcome, rest, the basic things that become moral tests the moment one person decides another must earn them differently. Amma had not entered the restaurant asking to be admired. She did not announce a title. She did not display wealth. She did not demand special treatment. She simply carried herself with the quiet assurance of a person who had spent a lifetime becoming whole. And somehow that was exactly what unsettled the people who wished to sort her too quickly. Because dignity in humble clothing can make shallow people nervous. It reminds them that their entire method of judgment may be broken. Now, with a fresh plate before her and the room finally forced into honesty, Amma ate the meal she should have been allowed to enjoy from the start. Hungry. Human. And at last seen. For Elena, the day had begun as another shift and ended as a doorway. She had only done what she believed was right. She had noticed a waiting woman. She had recognized unfairness. She had chosen a table over convenience, compassion over instruction, risk over silence. In many rooms those choices would have gone unrecognized. In some rooms they would have been punished. But not this day. Now her name sat in Malik's notes. A management training program waited somewhere beyond the walls of the restaurant. A different future had cracked open because she had refused to let another human being disappear on a bench by the front door. What Amma offered Elena was more than opportunity. It was a confirmation that character counts, especially when no reward is guaranteed. That the moments which seem smallest inside a shift or a workday or an ordinary afternoon can become the moments a life turns on. Elena would likely remember that for years, the hand on hers, the sentence spoken softly, the invitation to do more than serve tables. And perhaps one day, in some office or meeting or business of her own, she would remember another lesson too. That leadership is not proven first by how you handle important people. It is proven by how you treat the person everyone else is tempted to ignore. In that sense, Amma had not simply offered Elena a future. She had handed her a standard. As the lunch hour moved toward afternoon and the sharpest edge of the scene began to fade, the phrase lingered in the minds of everyone who had been there, even if no one spoke it aloud just yet. You never know who is sitting at the table you are trying to clear. It is a powerful warning because it touches pride. Because it reminds people that the stranger they dismiss may hold more status than they imagined. More wealth. More influence. More reach. It is the lesson that scares arrogance into temporary manners. But it is not the highest lesson. The higher lesson came right behind it. Should never matter. Not because power is unimportant in the world, but because decency should not require a surprise ending. Human worth should not depend on a dramatic reveal, a wealthy relative, a title, a corporation, a property portfolio, or 3 black SUVs pulling up outside to prove what should have been obvious from the start. Amma Kesse mattered before Malik arrived. She mattered before the building ownership was mentioned. She mattered while sitting on the bench. She mattered when the hostess lied. She mattered when the plate hit the trash. She mattered when the room went quiet. She mattered because she was a person. And that truth, once heard clearly, makes every smaller excuse sound as weak as it truly is. When the story of that afternoon lived on in memory, people would remember the details vividly. The polished shoes catching Houston's sun. The faded green dress in the back corner. The hard sound of a plate striking the rim of a trash can. The quiet voice on the phone saying, "Malik, I think you should come." The calm man in the charcoal suit crossing the room. The sentence that changed everything, "You did not need to know who I was." And then, perhaps most of all, they would remember the sight of Amma taking that final bite of fresh braised lamb in peace. Because that was the ending the world should have allowed her from the beginning. Not because she owned the building. Not because her grandson commanded attention. Not because a team stood behind him with tablets and lease files. But because she was hungry. Because she was tired. Because she walked in through a public door and asked for a seat. Because no person should have to reveal power to qualify for basic dignity. Because no meal should be guarded by status. Because no room should need fear in order to become decent. Because whether the SUVs came or not, whether the owner rushed in or not, whether anyone apologized or not, Kesse deserved to eat her food in peace. Because she was human. And that is enough.